Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special report brought to you in association with ASB. Today we're going to have a look at the issue of financial nationalism. Now many of you will have heard in the 1930s of a form of economic nationalism where trade restrictions were put in to protect jobs at home. Unfortunately, as we now know, all that did was restrict trade and cost more jobs on both sides of the borders. Now, most people now are trying to avoid this sort of trade restrictions and a sort of a bigger thy neighbour approach to economic policy. But now the focus has shifted to a form of nationalism in the financial markets called financial nationalism. Now, this has arisen because many of the world's biggest banks over the last decade or so have been lending heavily across borders to each other. Now, this has been great in terms of moving capital around the world and allowing savers in one country to effectively lend to consumers in other countries. But the problem is that model is now broken. Many of those banks are effectively insolvent. They've been bought by governments, and we've seen this in the United States and the UK in particular. Those banks are now pulling their lending back from across their borders because they're responsible to politicians who need votes in their countries, rather than to shareholders who want profits, regardless of where it happens. So that's a problem for those people who have borrowed from overseas banks. And New Zealand is not immune here. About 40% of our funding has come from international banks. And about 60% of that funding, that international funding, is rolled over every year or so. Now, the worst case scenario is that all of those foreign banks would simply say, no, you can't keep the money, let's have it back. That would be disastrous. But you've got to remember, most of our funding, international funding, is actually from Australia. And that's going to help us because it's highly unlikely that the Australian banks would demand of their local subsidiaries that they be repaid in an awful hurry. That's our saving grace, that we're effectively part of an Australasian regional banking group. If we were out on our own, like Iceland, we'd be in all sorts of grief. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was a special report on financial nationalism and the threat to the global economy. That was a special report brought to you in association with ASB.